We've got a lot of phenomenal resource people here helping us deal with one of the most challenging problems in the world, is this addiction to militarism and war as a means of resolving conflict. This afternoon's panel, the 4 o'clock panel, is focused on capitalism and the war economy and the transition to a peace economy, which is absolutely critical if we're really going to be able to make this transition. We can't just continue to rely on militarism and violence and wars as a way of our economic livelihood if we're going to really make that conversion. So our two resource people are Gar Alperovitz, who I have heard about for the last 40 years. Gar has had a distinguished career as a historian, political economist, activist, writer, and government official. He's written a number of books. He's the co-chair of the Next System Project, a project of the Democracy Collaborative, which to me is a really exciting proposal and project that I look forward to hearing about. Thank you. Gar.
Thank you. 100 years ago, when I was much younger, and I was a high State Department official for about 1 year. Very complex reason why that. I had just written a book saying the United States started the Cold War and bombed Hiroshima to do it, and then was invited to the highest level of the State Department. Odd explanation. We'll talk about that at another point. But what I saw in terms of the last panel, and it's critical to what I think was being said, and Gareth's proposal is extremely important and I think really timely, was that the policy of the United States was to use the United Nations not in any way as a place for solving peace problems, but to bounce propaganda off of at the American people. It was a backboard. Someone would go up and make a big speech at the UN about all the good things we're doing. It had nothing to do with the UN. It had to do with sending a message to the front page of the New York Times about what the policy is to convince the United States population of what they were doing. It was totally in line with the policy of the way in which the Vietnam War was created and the way the Iraq War was created as well. So there's a huge propaganda effort that's much more sophisticated than most of us have understood. And the last panel I thought was brilliant in the beginning to open up how hard it is and how important it is to really go after these. So I just want to open that piece. The other piece is about, and again, these are by way of opening, how many know that there is a $1 trillion effort now underway to build more nuclear weapons? Thankfully. The press hasn't covered it, and Obama endorsed it and supports it. It is a major, major, major danger because it's driving everybody else in the system to do the same damn thing. So that piece of the nuclear issue, I think, is now back on the table, but I don't think the peace movement has even picked up on it at all yet, and it is a big deal. The third, by way of introduction and simply by way of my own context, the three major post-war wars were all unconstitutional and need to be delegitimated as such. The Korean War was so-called police effort made by Truman by off-the-cuff bouncing it through the UN in a way that was totally illegal. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution was totally dishonest and ramrodded through the Congress. We now know that. We knew it at the time. I was working in the Senate at the time. We knew that, tried to oppose it. And obviously what's happened with Iraq was totally dishonest. So there is a fundamental problem of democracy at war, in terms of war efforts now, to say nothing of all the secret and all the other things that are going on time and time again. So I want to reinforce exactly some of the things that were said at the last. It's time to open up a big, big picture. A broader question is, and I think, and this reinforces, I think, again, some of the things were said, but also opens the way to what I want to really talk about. Have you noticed that someone called a socialist got a lot of votes in the... That runs contrary to anything anyone, I suspect, in this room believed was possible, that language was accessible to the American people. And I think the lesson there is that it is time to open up much bigger and more fundamental questions and not worry about what it is, oh, you can't say that. I think what's important is to explain it and to be clear and to be specific and to get on with it. But it is a critical change that people, housewives, the ones I loved were housewives in Iowa. I'm from Wisconsin. We're talking about, yeah, I'm a democratic socialist too, aren't you? And the language opened up a space, I think, for us to really begin to reshape and Americanize the attack on the national security state in new language that's down home, ordinary Wisconsin and Iowa based. I don't have that language, but I think there's an accessibility. So the two things I want to talk about, one is my own entrance into this set of questions on the economy and American foreign policy had to do with American expansionism and how U.S. imperialism was built and where it came from and how the expansion of the system became the basis for an imperial structure. Importantly, it was an imperial structure that was complex and nuanced in that many of the actors, this is, I think, critically important, and we've got it from William Appleman Williams and those historians, believed that what they were doing was actually in the interests of democracy. They were not, many of them, phonies. They thought stopping communism, in its craziness, was a really important moral thing to do. If you don't get that piece, you don't get why it was so easy for them to sell it. And many of them authentically had that idea. Now, it was to use a technical term, it was cockamamie. I mean, that isn't what they were doing. But they thought they were. And many people did think we're saving the world, the free world, all that rhetoric had genuine meaning to some people. So that underpinning it and cracking it and showing that it isn't that way is a piece of the whole challenge we're having. My entrance to the question of American imperialism is how do you look at a system, capitalism, that must inherently expand in order to succeed. If it doesn't expand, it collapses and falls. So the pressure of the whole system was built on the notion, and this is well developed in the historical literature by now, was somehow we need world markets, and somehow we need investment outlets, and somehow we need raw materials, the most obvious ones being oil in the Middle East. And that is an important way, and here's the hard part, to make the American economy work, and it was and is, and also to make the world economy work, and it was and is, even though it does it badly. That was how they stabilized the system in their minds. These are capitalist systems. We aren't in socialist frameworks. But they understood, and genuinely, they'd gone through World War I, World War II, big collapse, crisis, economic difficulties, et cetera, produced Hitler in their minds. Somehow the whole globalization idea in their heads was a way to stabilize the world in order to prevent the next Third World War in 1 century. That idea, first, is wrong, and secondly, needs to be challenged, but it's really important to understand where they were coming from and to pick up and crack it directly. More importantly, a capitalist system must expand in order to keep stability. That's how it works. If you don't expand, you go into crisis. And that is the real reality problem, that if you don't expand, you run into crisis and you collapse or you go into recession and depression. That's the nature of capitalism. That puts you back in the question of how you build a different system that doesn't produce expansionism, but also succeeds. So in one way or another, you're into something like a socialist system. That is the system that doesn't require expansion. And the question is how we actually begin to open that understanding, let alone the politics of it. I'll come back to the politics of it. An understanding that we're talking about a different system for real, if we're to get beyond the expansionism that produces globalism and global intervention. And I think people are on the verge of that. So that one of the propositions is how do you produce a non-expansionary system? And one of the elements of that is the next time we have a big banking crisis, the banks have to become public rather than private after we take them over. Or General Motors and Chrysler go down and we make them into mass transit and high-speed rail systems. But public. But notice, we in fact nationalized all of those institutions. We did do that. And the next time around, if we're prepared, or the next time beyond, there will be more opportunities if we begin to actually sketch out the requirements of a different system. Now, I'm emphasizing here because we don't usually emphasize it. What do you do about big stuff? like big corporations that do mass transit or high-speed rail or airplanes. Anybody here fly in a big airplane, go to China recently or Europe? Who builds it? And how do you get that? Most of our discussion of the next economy has not reached to what do you do about big institutions. And inevitably, one form or another has to be public. And that debate has to start. Where I come into the discussion, and there are two projects that I'm going to describe to you, probably many of you know about them. One is called the New Economy Movement, and the other is called the Next System Project. The New Economy Movement is dedicated to trying to rebuild the economy from the ground up. And it is they're a huge, growing movement. There was a large conference of 1,000 practitioners this summer in Buffalo. And what people are doing is building co-ops, worker-owned companies, publicly owned land trusts at the local level, public banks. Philadelphia and Santa Fe are setting up city-owned banks, like the Public Bank of North Dakota. There is a whole explosion on the ground of beginning at the ground level with changing the principles of operation of the system away from capitalism, away from expansion, and towards community, and towards primarily and fundamentally democratizing ownership. Now, this isn't covered by the press. Last panel, please take this up. The press does not cover this. Why? One reason is that the local press doesn't cover anything locally. They don't have much capacity anymore. And secondly, they certainly don't cover anything that's on the left locally, so they don't even know about it. There's a lot of websites. One is called community-wealth.org or .com, put the dash in, that cover this kind of stuff. But it is exploding all over the country. In Philadelphia and Santa Fe, they're setting up city-owned public banks. So there are, I think the last time I saw it, there are something like 30 million people involved in co-ops around the country. There's a big project called 50 by 50 to set up 50 million workers in worker-owned companies by 2050. So there's an expanding effort which begins to lay the groundwork for what an alternative system, not dependent either on military spending or expansionism, might begin to look like. And I just want to encourage you to begin thinking about what, in fact, is the nature, and this is a theoretical problem as well. If you don't like corporate capitalism and you don't like state socialism, what the hell do you want? And indeed, there are a lot of people beginning to actually ask that question intelligently. That is, what is the structure, starting at the neighborhood or the community? How do you look at cities, city socialism or community socialism or neighborhood ownership or cooperative ownership? How do you build up and principles the Catholic Church calls subsidiarity, from the bottom up, growing right up to those big things that have to be at larger scale? What is the role of regionalism? Here's a question for you. If you want to think about the next system in the U.S. economy, here's a toughie. Tell me, somebody in the audience, how we have participatory democracy in a 3,000-mile continent, corner to corner, with 350 million people. You got an answer to that, you win. Obviously, the question of democracy itself in the economic system is on the table. If you get serious about, I bet a lot of people in this room want to change the system. If they get serious about what that actually means, that becomes one of the questions. From my perspective, partly as a historian and a political economist, I think this period of history that we've entered is potentially the most important period of American history, bar none. Let me say what I mean. I think they ran the system in the 19th century by taking over land and destroying native cultures and slavery. And when they ran out of those options in the 20th century, they began a global imperial effort to control the system. And they're running out of that option. They're running out of, the war economy doesn't do it anymore. That whole big defense budget's only 3% of the GDP. It doesn't do what is needed to stimulate the economy. And I think they've run out of land in the 19th century, and they're running out of war in the 20th century of the kind that can manage their domestic economic problems and their social problems. So the whole question of how you actually run something is on the table for the first time, I think, in American history. That we are entering a period, that's what Bernie was all about. He was totally surprised. But the pain levels from the failure of the system to be managed, even by military spending, are very high. Now, the nasty part of that is it throws a real responsibility on us. because it's a period when really opening alternatives. Really, what do you really want to change the system? How does that really look? How do you build from the ground up now? And when the next crisis comes, be ready with answers at the national level and the regional level. Becomes a how-to problem, not a rhetorical problem. So that's another piece of the puzzle I want to talk about. I want to at least emphasize that there's a great movement going on at all levels of this. We're publishing in the Next System project, we're publishing a whole debate. The different people, Rick Wolf, some of you know Richard Wolf, has been urging worker-owned companies. Some people as a basis point for a system. That's a little difficult when you get to national large scale, but that's one theme. Some people are emphasizing community structure. Some begin with agriculture and some begin with technology. But there is an informed, sophisticated, thoughtful, and intelligent debate beginning and practical experimentation all over the country. It's not covered by the press at all. The press doesn't cover the things we talked about in the last panel, but it surely doesn't discuss this, that have any consideration of this. Been two big conferences on the theory of all this that we were able to get friends at Harvard, one Harvard and one MIT, saying legitimating the debate. Presidents of the Political Science Association, there's a number of progressive ones, are signing on. So Danny Glover was involved. We've got Noam is involved in all this. Noam Chomsky's involved. So there's a whole attempt to really regenerate a positive way to how do you actually change the system? What does it really mean? And then how do we politicize that? And what can you do practically? And I think that is one of the critical answers to the whole war system, which is where I start. I start with nuclear weapons and imperialism. But I think now the short way to handle this, and I think it's useful but not perfect, is military conversion. People think about military conversion as one way. Yes, that's important, but you know that this vast military budget is only 3% of the economy. Yes, 3.3% to be precise. It's a very, very cheap way to run a world empire in a very big economy. That's the number, 3.3%. And so it isn't true that if we cut the military budget, you destroy the economy. But it is true that we need to build up an alternative economic system, different from the ground up, and a different vision and a theory and a politics. Let me say that again shortly. We need to build up a theory, practical experiments, policy, and a politics. Now, I just said something. You want to play this game? That's 3 decades of your life. Don't mess with it otherwise, because that's what you're talking about, actually changing the most powerful corporate capitalist system in the world. And there is an opening. Could go to the right, could go to the left, but it's the first time in my adult lifetime, where I've actually seen the depth and deepening of the crisis. And Bernie's, I think, just the beginning of it. But it turns out that for people who care about war and peace issues that we're talking about, part of it has to be addressing the whole economic question in large. What produces imperialism? How do we deal with conversion? And more important, how do we build a positive economy? Now, one of the things where the next speaker and I really share a very strong understanding, I think, together in a slightly different way, is that if you can't build a healthy, cooperative, and democratic and sustainable local community, you can't build anything up from that footing. So the culture of a collective community of mutual responsibility and sharing is a precondition of actually changing the larger culture and the peace culture. But how do you do that when the economy, locally you can do many, many things. We're going to hear a good deal about what's going on the ground. But in some parts of the country, what you find is, we've been working in Youngstown. I started in Youngstown, Ohio with the steel workers. Youngstown, boom, was wiped out. The town has lost two-thirds of its population because the steel industry went down. Or if you look at Cleveland, it's gone from 900,000 to 400,000. The, quote, community ain't there. So you're talking about planning systems ultimately that can help stabilize communities, or take Detroit, from a million people gone. 1 million people. Where did they go? Nobody cares. Nobody cares. But you can't begin even to build unless you face that. You can begin to build, but ultimately the question of how you stabilize communities becomes part and parcel of a larger structure and system-changing model. So, but the real question ultimately is, and I'm going to throw a couple numbers at you, is in a very, very, very rich, I've got 2 minutes left, rich economy. And what I mean by that, right now, today, if you broke the economy up equally, it's $235,000 for every family of 4. It is a very rich system. It increased 7-fold in the 20th century. The next century, if it does the same, and we've got new technologies, the potential is radically to reduce the work week and to have a very egalitarian society. We're already at almost $250,000 for every family of 4 currently, if you broke it up equally. So the question is how you actually begin to raise up this beginning discussion of start with community, but how you change the system, the Bernie discussion, and begin to make that real in the coming period of American politics. I think this is I think this is doable. I think the sort of thing Gary was talking about gives us hope about that. I think this new economy movement that is just popping up all over the country, but you don't see it because it's not covered in the press at all. I think there are good signs of that, the signs that there are intellectuals and theorists working on systemic design. Genuinely, not rhetoric, genuinely. How would the damn thing work if you made it all worker ownership? Well, worker-owned companies are a competitive marketplace. They look like capitalists sometimes. But if you do it by community, what happens then? Well, sometimes they don't get efficient enough. Real problems are genuinely on the table and very important. It's a very rich prehistory period, I think. So my hope would be that we can begin to bring together the two movements and the sort of thing that Gary's talking about that begin not only to talk about war and peace issues, but also talking about changing the system itself directly, starting, most important, at the ground up and working our way up from there. Thank you very much.